Hello, everyone, and welcome to Putting Patient-Centric Principles into Practice, presented by Rowe. I'm Joe Keenan, contributing editor for Fierce Markets, and I'll be moderating this webinar today. Our speakers are Shan Williams, PMP, Senior Director of Operations at Rowe, Ryan Bailey, MA, Senior Clinical Researcher at Rowe, and Derek Lawrence, Senior Clinical Data Manager at Rowe. You can read their full bios on the right side of your window. Just a few technical notes before we begin. If you have trouble reading a slide, please hold and drag the right corner of the slide window to enlarge. Please also disable your pop-up blocker to participate in the interactive parts of this presentation. If you'd like to download the slide deck, click the Resources button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. We will follow the presentation with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions during or after the presentations using the purple Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. Okay, now let's begin. Ryan, please go ahead.
Thank you, Joe, and good morning to everyone. On behalf of the presenters, we're delighted to be with you today to talk about putting patient-centered principles into practice. Joe very kindly introduced our team, so I'm going to kind of advance through this slide and just tell you what we're going to kind of cover today. I'm going to attempt to lay a foundation for why patient centricity is inevitable and necessary, I think, but also beneficial for patients and researchers. Shan is going to build off of that by sharing some of our experiences implementing patient-centered strategies at the project planning and project management level, and talk about how you can do some of the same in your projects. And Derek is going to wrap us up with an exploration of techniques for leveraging data collection and data management efforts to improve patient engagement. And as Joe said, we'll have time at the end for Q&A. Before I start, I want to give us just a very basic working definition of patient centricity. As it sounds, it's all about putting patients at the center of all we do, about valuing and addressing patient concerns and needs, and really treating patients as partners in the research program, not guinea pigs or a pathway to a payday. And really the presentation today is trying to unpack what that means in practical terms, what that means for us as we're conducting research. So to start, since this is a presentation on patient centricity, I thought I would begin with a patient story, a personal story. So in the summer of 2011, my wife Jessica was in labor with our first child, and we found ourselves sitting alone in a delivery room during one of these stretches where they had her hooked up to monitors, but they didn't have to be watching her. And we were anxious, first-time parents, as you can imagine, tense and stressed and uncertain. And we were it was about 16 hours into her labor. We were in the room, and a young man entered that we hadn't met before. And we thought, well, maybe he's here to kind of check on her, one of the revolving door of kind of nurses that were coming in and out. Instead, after a somewhat hasty and awkward introduction, he began to recruit my wife while in labor to participate in a research study on Fragile X syndrome using blood taken from her son right after delivery. And as you might imagine, my wife had no mental capacity for this, and she gave me this look like, you've got to deal with this. So I did what any self-respecting husband and father-to-be would do. I sat and participated in an informed consent process for this research study. And even though I was a study coordinator at the time, I was intimately familiar with the consent process, I had almost no ability to focus on what he was saying or what they were asking us to do. So the question for you, fellow researchers, is what in the world were those study planners thinking? I mean, someone seriously wrote that protocol, that procedure that a stranger is going to approach a woman in labor while she is in pain and stress, start talking about how her soon-to-be-born child could have a genetic disorder, and try to recruit her to a study. So, I mean, do you think anybody involved in the planning of that study took the time to consult a patient on their design, on that decision? So where was the study team in the 8 months of the prenatal visits that we got to that same hospital? There was over half a year of better opportunities to recruit her, and they literally waited until just about the worst possible time. Now, after the fact, my wife and I are able to laugh at how absurd that moment was, and everything was fine with delivery. But I had a moment of clarity a few weeks later when I was back at the office, and I thought to myself, have I ever made a similarly poor decision in my work? I mean, how many times have I made a decision about a study procedure without considering the patient's experience, or more pointedly, actually asking a patient for their input? How many times have you sought out a patient's input for the studies that you're involved with, the studies that you're designing? Sometimes our well-intentioned but nearsighted view that we're the experts and we know what's best, we've done this, we have years of experience, it can trip us up a little bit. And it turns out that there's actually a condition for this that psychologists call the earned dogmatism effect. And it just means that it can lead to closed-minded thinking among people who are deemed experts. And where else do we have more experts gathered together than in the clinical research space? And we have people who are experts in science, in medicine, in disease, in research, data, analysis, all working together. But what about the patient? The patient is the expert on their symptoms, the impact of their disease, the burden of their treatment, what it means to them to be cured or cared for to their satisfaction. So, if we fail to acknowledge this, we run the risk of trying to solve some of the important equations that we're trying to solve, answer some of the questions we're trying to answer without all the variables, without all the input that we need. So I issue a two-part invitation to you today. Join us in some self-reflection, some well-intended critique of our industry as we consider what it means to pursue a patient-centered research, and try to walk away with at least one, hopefully more, but at least one actionable item, something you can take back with you to your teams to address this question of how we put patients at the center of all we do. So with that in mind, let's consider why patient centricity is such a hot topic for our industry at the moment in the first place. First of all, patient empowerment is happening in healthcare. And there are a number of factors that I think are contributing to this, but some of the ones that are the most obvious or easiest to see evidence of, I think, are the information is readily available for patients online now. And you can go online and research your disease and get more information in an hour than you can in 3 or 4 visits to your doctor's office, where you only get to talk to the physician for 5, maybe 10 minutes if you're lucky. And that's not to say that the information that's all available online is necessarily accurate or the best information for patients, but they're seeking that out, and then they're bringing that to bear on the care that they're receiving and the way they're treating and managing their disease. Likewise, I think patients are increasingly viewing themselves as consumers of healthcare, not passive recipients of it. So it's kind of similar. You can go online, you can shop for providers, you can read reviews, leave reviews of your providers, and I think this is changing healthcare, and it's impacting us in research. But at the same time, healthcare and research are increasingly focused on providing care for distinct individuals. We study unique phenotypes, other subgroups, which we call personalized or precision medicine. So both patients and physicians really seem to be pushing medicine to a place of greater emphasis on the individual patient, and this also is leading to, I think, sort of patient empowerment. Another factor is how our industry is being perceived by patients and the public. And unfortunately, a lot of what's out there right now isn't very positive. I'm going to share some quotes with you and some things I found that sort of illustrate this. One of the things is that there's some barriers to participation in our trials. And you get quotes like this from this woman whose mother had ALS, was trying to get enrolled in a study and was unable to before she passed away. And her quote is that she felt like she was always fighting the FDA, and the FDA was protecting her to death. You also have examples of patients feeling like they don't have a voice, they don't have a say in the process. This quote comes from a lupus patient health advocate who said, patients have to be part of the solution. Patients are the best ones to say what worked and what didn't, and patients want to talk, but they are often ignored. And I often hear patients say, why don't they ask us? They, meaning us, researchers, why don't they ask us? Why don't they hear what we have to say? Now, consider what happens if we ignore the patient voice. What I've got pulled up here on the screen is a chart from the website Patients Like Me. This is an online community where patients can connect and share information about their disease. it has this nice chart about the common symptoms reported by people with asthma along with a severity score. So the scale here, green or red is severe, orange is moderate, yellow is mild, green means none. They haven't experienced the symptoms. And when I got this chart, some 3,700 patients had entered data into it. And what I want to show you here is if I add this green box, and I picked this because I work primarily in asthma research, what we see is that wheezing and coughing, two of our most common patient-reported outcomes in asthma, patients have marked as severe or moderate, 24% of the cases, 28% of the cases, respectively. So no big surprise there. But I'm going to add another box. Once you look in orange boxes, the two symptoms that stand out the most in terms of severity. So in this case, you've got fatigue reported 69%, severe or moderate, pain, 63% report severe or moderate pain. Yet I rarely see fatigue and pain as specific outcome measures in asthma research. Now, there's a lot that may go into this. Presumably, these patients have medications that are helping with their wheezing. Wheezing isn't perceived maybe as disruptive to their life, but I show this to illustrate a key point. This right here, this chart shows what patients say they're bothered by, what they're concerned about related to their disease. And I think the question for us is, are we paying attention to what our patients are saying, what they care about? Now, if you take all of this, barriers to participation, lack of voice, missing maybe what matters to patients, I think then you get into a situation where it results in a loss of trust. And this is, I think, really dangerous for us in research. He quotes like this from a double cancer survivor, patient advocate, who said the perception of pharma is poor and it doesn't help to see them spending $4 billion a year in drug ads made by people who obviously don't know someone who is sick. So a pretty pointed, sharp comment there. Of course, every few years, it also seems that we have some case that gets a lot of press about a company seeming to value profits over patients. And this past year, we heard a lot about the company that manufactures EpiPens and how they decided to price them. And then you can look in the news and see articles, things like this. This is an article reported on a Gallup poll that found that only the federal government is held in lower esteem than the pharmaceutical industry. And I don't know about you, but that is not a company I want to be keeping right now at the bottom of that list. So, this is our industry, and you and I know it's a lot more complicated than some people make it out to be, and there's some bad apples maybe that can kind of damage it for the rest of us. And I get the privilege of working with really excellent people who are fully devoted to doing good research, advancing medicine, healing, protecting patient well-being. But I think the trick and the real challenge here is not to get defensive. I think the negative perception that we face, if you will forgive a really painful pun, is a tough pill to swallow. But it's the reality, and we're not going to overcome it with a bunch of well-reasoned arguments about the benefits of our work and how we're improving healthcare. I think we're going to overcome it by showing patients that we care about them and how we treat them in all phases of research. So, in other words, I think the future of our industry really depends on taking a patient-centered approach. This is coming. In many ways, I think it's already here, and we can't afford to be the ones not responding to it in clinical trials. And I mean that literally, that we can't afford to not respond to it. We work with a number of small to mid-sized companies, and it's not uncommon for them to have less room for error, less in terms of finances and timelines. And in some cases, acquiring the next round of funding may depend on achieving a key milestone in an individual study by a certain time frame, many of which are directly dependent upon patients and our relationships with them. Things like achieving a target enrollment, preventing patient dropout, and things like that. But really, regardless of company size or assets, I think this is something we have to address as an industry if we're going to remain viable. We say, a rising tide raises all ships. I think patient frustration, patient distrust in our industry is a falling tide that threatens to strand all ships. So for that reason, I say that patient experience can't be vastly different in research than it is in care. And I emphasize the word vastly here because obviously research is different from care, and many people have argued, and rightly so, that if we're too accommodating in this space, we might jeopardize the quality and integrity of our work. And I understand that sentiment and think that we have to do good science, but we also have to consider, try explaining that perspective to the patient. To them, it's their life, it's their health care. if they aren't treated with the same respect that they get from their doctor, if they feel like a lab rat instead of a human being, they're going to leave research and they're probably not going to come back. So we have to manage our risk here. We have to take the good aspects of care without threatening the integrity of our research and still do good science. I'd also just argue that since our work is traditionally on the leading edge of treatment and care, we should be ahead of the curve on this particular trend, not the ones struggling to catch up to it. That's a little bit of my adapt or die message, but fortunately I think there's another set of driving factors here that I find a little more appealing, and that's that patient centricity is beneficial to us in the clinical research space. First of all, for one thing, patients are the heroes of clinical research. I think it's always good to be reminded of why we do what we do. We're in the business of healing people, and we do that by relying on other generous people to put their bodies on the line, to attend visits, to be poked and prodded, to share blood, tissue, and data with us so that we can help heal them and help heal others. We have this ethical imperative to do right by them. We have a lot in place to help us when it comes to patient safety and well-being, and I've listed a few of our sort of seminal guidances here. But I fear that this sometimes leads to this sort of misleading notion that, well, we've really solved the patient rights stuff. We've addressed that already, which I think is a little narrow-minded, but more to the point, beyond just recognizing our past, we need to always be considering what lies ahead. I mean, what's next on the continuum of evolving ethical milestones that define our work? And I think much of it will come from patient centricity efforts. And what's really exciting, at least to me here, is that we have a chance to kind of change the dialogue right now. We maybe historically have had this approach of saying, well, here's what we're going to do for patients. We being the research community, here's putting our expert hats on, here's what we're going to do for you. And we can change that dialogue now to say, no, we want to do with patients. We want to move beyond the patient being a trial participant and into the space of being maybe a trial partner to contribute their voice to what we're doing, to help us figure out what matters to them, and then to do it. I also want to point out that I think patient centricity is really in our DNA. Yes, it's a bit of an emerging trend right now in our industry, but it didn't come out of nowhere. It's a natural extension of a variety of disciplines and movements that we have long cared about, things like adherence and retention and patient advocacy and personalized medicine, patient-reported outcomes. They have all laid the groundwork for this. And as a result, we have a lot in research, a lot of history that we can draw upon here, and why we can say, I think with some confidence, that patient engagement is actually really good for research. For example, we already know that focusing on patient needs and patient experience leads to better recruitment and retention. Likewise, research demonstrates that engaged patients have better adherence, better health outcomes. There's also some really excellent work coming out of the partnership between the DIA and Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development that shows that this doesn't have to be onerous and disruptive to the study. They found that some of the simplest, most affordable, lowest time commitment investments can have some of the best returns. And I think this is good news for everyone, but kind of, as I said before, especially for maybe some of the smaller companies who tend to focus on rare diseases or special indications, have a lot riding on these phase 1, phase 2 efforts before they can get backing for larger phase 3 trials. The good news is these efforts don't have to break our backs or break the bank to be successful. And practically speaking, once you learn what works for a particular group of patients, you then get to build upon that for future research and gain some efficiencies over time. So I think the case is becoming stronger and stronger that patient centricity efforts really benefit our key performance indicators. And very soon, and probably we're already there, we're going to be in a situation where the question isn't how much does it cost to do patient centricity, but how much does it cost to ignore the benefits of doing this. So I've said a lot so far, so I kind of want to end on a simpler note before I hand it off to Shan, which first with a final quote that I think cuts through some of the clutter, and I'll pull it up in just a minute, but it comes from the mother of a child with cystic fibrosis who managed to attend a professional conference on treating CF. And at the end of the conference, she asked why there weren't more patients present, and she was told that patients would be a distraction to the highly scientific conversations taking place. And this is her quote: "How could I help people see what I believed so deeply? That by having patients and families as partners, putting them front and center to share their stories, their experiences, their expertise, and combining that with the clinical expertise of the many doctors and scientists working so hard to cure this disease, that we could go further than ever before." Let's just consider how simple of a request this is from a patient. We want to come and learn, to share, and to be heard. So to help avoid that situation in our work, I want to leave you with a simple acronym because we don't have enough acronyms in our industry, but hopefully this one is easy, simple enough to keep in mind. I say clear the air. Air, ask, inform, respect the patient. Yes, we do a lot of talking in our trials, so this just starts by saying, let's ask questions and then let's listen. Let's learn from our patients. Then when it's time to talk, it's time to communicate, we want to do it frequently and often. We want to focus on what the patient needs and wants to hear, though. And yes, we need to protect study integrity, but we don't want to treat patients like, we're the FBI and they're on a need-to-know basis. And ultimately, it all comes down to respect. Our patients are people just like us, and every one of us is going to be a patient at some point in our life. So we're only really extending to the patients in our trials the same respect and empathy we would hope to get if we were sick, in pain, nervous, hoping to find a cure that would improve our lives and improve the lives of other people. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Shan.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Ryan focused on the background and benefits of patient centricity and focusing on patients. And I'm going to talk through some of our experiences and what we've done, more actionable strategies to simplify and potentially demystify patient centricity a bit. And, simplify might not be the right term to use because although the terms and experience that I'm going to talk through are fairly simple practices and things that I think that our industry has been doing for years, they can often be overwhelming and feel like we don't know where to start. But my premise here is that it's not rocket science, right? So much like me trying to read one of these books, when we first started talking and thinking about patient centricity and all of the different things that we could do, it can be, as I said, very overwhelming. So it's important for us to start, just start with something. Start with some things that we're already doing. So as Ryan pointed out, the smaller bangs the smaller bucks, I guess, can lead to the bigger bangs. So everyone knows the old saying, how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. And so how do we approach this concept and what often people are referring to as the buzzword right now in our industry? And I feel like small bite-sized, if you will, portions in the right direction will help us move forward to some of the things that Ryan pointed out. So there are two fundamental concepts that I wanted to go over today based on our experience, and they both tie in with, as Ryan mentioned, the DIA TUF study outlines for some simple things that you can do regarding easing patient burden and then facilitating effective communication to patients and other stakeholders like their families and their primary care providers, for example, if they're outside of the study team. So the things that we've already been doing for years and we know that work for high retention rates and ensuring that patients are enrolled effectively in the trials can be used for patient centricity with a little bit of a shift in our perspective. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. So the first one I'm going to talk through is easing patient burden. And as I said, we know these things, right? We know that there are things that we can do to retain subjects, to benefit the long-term success of our trial, to retain power for successful study outcomes. So, as we all know, patients choose to participate and enroll in studies because the value of their participation is going to outweigh the burden or the risk for them. So we can use some of these same principles. Several years ago, we were a part of an observational birth cohort study funded out of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases that really focused on some of these principles before there was the term patient centricity. This study is in its 12th year. We have, as you can see on the slide, over 600 children enrolled. And we have a very, very, very low loss of patients over time, especially for a long-term birth cohort study. And this was really important in order to meet the objectives of this longitudinal study. And the retention rate is attributable to several patient-focused practices that we put into place. And you can see the reference at the bottom of this slide. This is in clinical trials from 2010 if you want more information on what we did here. So I'm going to talk through some of these things. And like I said at the beginning, they're simple because you can put them into practice. They do take careful and upfront planning. And as Ryan was saying, it can actually lead to reduced costs later on. So if we take the time up front to plan our protocols well and to consider some of these things, then we will expedite the study process and have patients more at the center over the long haul. So I don't know about you, but I can barely juggle work and kids and daily life and an occasional doctor's visit. So the idea of participating in a clinical trial, even for someone like me who's invested and passionate about our industry, is sort of a non-starter. Like I can't even imagine fitting it in. And so one of the things that we need to do is not expect that our patients and our participants are going to accommodate our schedules. We have to think about the logistics of what we're asking them to do from their perspective. Do they need to take off work? Will they need to miss school? Are they going to have to deal with the complexities and stress of hospital and clinic parking decks? How many of us actually complete surveys that we receive in the mail and return them, or respond to mass email inbox queries? And how likely are we to respond? Are we more likely to respond to a text message that we receive or to return a call left on our cell phone and voicemail, right? And if we don't think about these things and these kinds of questions carefully for our specific target populations, then we may be setting ourselves up for study failure, and we won't be closer to relieving the burden of clinical trial participation. So, for example, even if a protocol is designed with patient outcomes in mind, the things that are most important to that therapeutic area for those patients, without implementing some of these basic principles, we cannot enroll effectively or take that patient into consideration. So there were 8 patient-focused practices employed by the Eureka study and discussed in detail in the publication that I mentioned. And you can see that these aren't rocket science. They do take careful planning and time, and they have some budgetary considerations, but they're things that we can easily employ and we may already be doing for our studies. So, for example, can your clinical sites or staff conduct calls outside of regular office hours? Can we collect times when patients are more likely to be available for recruitment or to come into the clinic? Hiring culturally competent staff is huge. Staff that not only speak the language, for example, but understand the nuances of this specific population, and those that can identify with the challenges or considerations in a specific demographic. Flexible visit scheduling, along the same lines as conducting calls after hours. Is the clinic open on Saturdays? Can patients come in the early morning or evenings to avoid missing work and school? Reimbursements, that's sort of a no-brainer. But also the type of reimbursement and the method. Are they going to need to cash a check? Do they need to get cash, for example, instead of a voucher? Those are things that working with the institution to meet the needs of the specific population is really important. Hosting retention events. So this is an example of something that worked for this specific population that may not work in other studies. These were mothers and their children. These events brought a sense of community, and patients got to know other patients that were in the same study. They were able to create relationships and deepen those with the research staff. And it goes back to really employing those culturally competent staff who know that population really well and what those patients are going to need to both focus on them throughout the duration of the trial, but then to also ensure success. Offering home visits. So this is something that we decided to do because the success of the study really hinged on our ability to meet the needs of the population. So young mothers with asthma do not want to hail a taxi in the winter in Boston to go across town to get a nasal lavage sample at Boston Children's, right? They want to be able to meet the needs of their child, and so having nurses come to the homes was something that we decided to do early on. Now, it also takes careful consideration in planning. You know, what are the insurance requirements for that institution, and hiring those folks who are already passionate, maybe who are trained in social work, is important. cell phone and texting reimbursements, and then also really simply just distributing quarterly newsletters. Derek is going to talk about data for patients later, but really what this was, it wasn't even their patient data, it was just giving them updates about where they were in the study so that the patients felt engaged. So how many participants we had enrolled or what milestones the study had achieved, and really making the patients feel like they were part of the team. So these retention practices are all excellent first steps. But we want to make sure that our perspective is in the right place, because we may be already doing some of these things, right? But we want to make sure that we're putting patients' needs above other goals for the research, because they will be able to feel that. They'll be able to tell what we want to achieve. So to further emphasize how our motivations play out to determine study success, I'm going to pause and share 2 patient stories. So the first patient here was yours truly. I was diagnosed with lupus and rheumatoid arthritis in 2004. And what mattered most to me at the time were these things on the slide. Really, people who listened to me, who answered my questions. I knew they couldn't cure what I was going through once I learned more about my disease, but the folks who were most empathetic and could give me information about my illness were the most important. I was in a lot of pain. I was going through a really difficult time where I couldn't even dress myself in the morning. And so providers that didn't rush through to the next appointment were the ones who meant the most to me in the time period and made me feel like there was hope, for example. And this isn't to say anything bad about my healthcare providers. I understand the healthcare industry and how busy all of our investigators are and our clinicians. It's more to focus on the clinical trial aspect and how in the midst of all of these healthcare busyness and stress with schedules, sometimes clinical trials are marginalized and they're not given the attention that they need in order to enroll effectively. So the quote on this slide is something that has been sort of burned into my brain from that time period, because I was crying on the phone with my healthcare provider when he said this to me. He was frustrated. He didn't know how he could help me. Nothing had worked up to that point. And I didn't even consider that this chemotherapy drug could have helped me because of the way that it was presented to me. And I'm sure that this pharmaceutical company would have been horrified to see how I was approached about this. And over time, I've thought, well, maybe my experience is just different than some of the patients that we're trying to recruit. But unfortunately, I don't think it really is. There's a reason why FISCRIP and ICON partnered last year and held the Inspiring Hope Ideathon to figure out how to better enroll patients in clinical research. There's a reason why we would need 1 in 6 people in the U.S. population if we were going to meet the current demand for enrollment based on the number of clinical trials that are listed on ct.gov. Something is broken, right, with the way that we're approaching our patients. So I want to contrast that with the story of patient 2. So I had to have my thyroid removed in November of this past year, and as I was listening to get called back, as I was in the waiting room to get called back for pre-op, I was sitting next to a family in a very small waiting room. I refer to this as waiting room eavesdropping, although I couldn't really help it. We were all together in one room. And a study coordinator sat and explained to this family a study that they were enrolling in where their 9-month-old little girl had been diagnosed with a very rare kidney disorder, and she was getting ready to go back and have it removed. What struck me most about listening to the way that the study coordinator presented this study was that her care. It wasn't about enrolling the little girl in the trial. It was about how this trial could or could not potentially help this little baby. It was more about wanting to make sure that this family had what they needed. They had the information that they needed to make the best decision about whether or not they wanted to enroll their baby girl. that she answered all of the questions that they had for her. And at the end, so apparently the study coordinator and the parents, they got called back. They must have signed the consent form, but the study coordinator came back and sat with the grandparents alone for another 20 minutes and just answered their questions. They asked her questions about their granddaughter's disease. They asked her things like, what if it's cancer, and started crying. It was profound to me how the study coordinator sat with them and just cared about them. That's why we're all in this industry, right? To an extent, I hope. And at the end of this sort of observation that I had the privilege of seeing, the grandmother looked at the study coordinator and said, out of months of asking physicians and nurses what's happening with our granddaughter, you were the first person who took the time to answer any of our questions. And I thought that was so heartwarming, of course, for me, but also a way that we should approach our research, right, with our patients. So I asked a nurse friend of mine recently if she had a class on bedside manner in her nursing program, and she kind of laughed and said, either you have it or you don't. And if you don't have it, you're going to have to work through it. And I thought, isn't this the bare minimum in easing patient burden? Isn't empathy and caring and listening and providing feedback part of what we're called to do in both research and healthcare? And it's fairly simple. I don't really think that it's one of those things like if you have it or you don't have it, you have to overcome that. I think it's something that we can learn and that we need to be providing to our patients in an ongoing way. So this sort of overlaps with effective communication and effective listening skills and empathy. Some of the things that we've also done in community-based research really is sort of part and parcel to the success of that research. So in order to do community-based research, you have to know your community. You have to talk with them. You have to engage them, or it's just not going to work. And so in the same way, engaging with our patients and stakeholders early on to see what their needs are, to learn the population, like I pointed out with those hosting retention events, is going to be key for the successful outcomes of the study. So one of the things that we did in a school and community-based asthma study was to engage the school nurses, to do focus groups with them, and to talk about the things that were going to facilitate success for that community. And if we hadn't done that, we would have designed a protocol that really may not have worked. This was a study that we were looking to reduce asthma-related absences in the school system in both the Denver and Hartford communities, and we had to do different things in the two different populations. Hearing from the school nurses about what was going to work in those populations was critical in order for us to effectively do this research. The results of this are currently being submitted to publication, but we did have a positive outcome for that study. So this is really in line with what the DIA TOUGH study outlined, as Ryan mentioned before, with protocol design and study volunteer feedback, and really emphasizes the importance of that effective communication. So to end, this isn't the whole elephant. It's not rocket science. I think, yeah, my rocket ship took off on the elephant there. This is only one small bite, right? There are lots of things that we could be doing, but I hope that what you gathered from my portion of the talk is that you could look at the things that we're currently doing, that you're planning to do for successful retention, and see if you might want to tweak the approach a bit to focus more on patient needs. Now I am going to turn it over to Derek, who is going to talk about data and systems.
Good morning, everyone. So far, we've heard Shannon and Ryan go over kind of the overarching foundational pieces of patient centricity and actionable strategies from Shan. And I think the third component, the final component of our presentation, and a major one, is how can we best leverage our data and systems to help support these endeavors. And the first question that we have that we set out to answer with this is, where data can be best put to use. Our entire industry is built on data. We are literally drowning in data, from everything from site metrics to clinical data itself to study metadata to past trials to future performance. Our industry is absolutely replete with mineable data sources. And the reason for this is all of the data exists to answer various questions. Our industry is out to help the patient by answering various questions. Now, we all have different iterations of these questions, but we need to keep in mind that the patients who are participating in these trials have questions of their own. And we can use the data and systems that we have to help them as well in our quest for information that's going to help them. And it's not about collecting different types of data than we currently have. We actually have a treasure trove of data that we can mine to support these efforts. We just need to get more mileage out of the data that we currently possess. And lastly, it has to be flexible and adaptable, as we're not sure what's going to be important to the patients in any given trial. So being flexible in how we approach returning data, visualizing data, and assigning importance to data needs to change as the needs and desires of the patients change. So as Shan said, in agreement with a slight twist, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but we should be consistently looking at new ways to improve the technology and processes around what we're doing. So just starting with a quote here, data by itself is useless. Data is only useful if you apply it. So again, with all of the data that we currently have, if we're not using it to help advance these causes, the data that we're collecting is useless for patient centricity if we can't identify it and basically weaponize it for use. And so there are gradations of data within patient centricity, but this portion of the presentation will focus on 3 primary points. And at a macro level, the outcome of the study and its success or failure. At a finer level of granularity, the return and exploration of the individual patient's data. And then lastly, assessing the value of patient-centric initiatives. So starting at the study outcome level, by and large, the biggest complaint is most patients actually never hear about the outcome in the trials in which they participate. Now, this is something that they're spending time and effort and hopefully enthusiasm that they want to help answer these questions with us. And to not include them in the discussion of the results is to spectacularly fail them. We've given a version of this presentation previously, and I'd refer to this to Shan and Ryan as this is the gumbo effect. Imagine you have 4 people come over to your house to help you make gumbo. One person is peeling shrimp, another person is cutting vegetables. You have them put the whole thing together, another person stirring roux. And then at the end, while it's stewing, you thank them for their efforts, and then you kindly escort them out. They don't get a place at the table to actually enjoy the fruit of their labor, their efforts, their time. And an easily comprehensible summary of this data is an essential component in making patients real stakeholders, that they participated in this, that their effort meant something. And I mean, I would imagine most of you have a 401k account, and financial institutions and investment firms are required no later than 45 days from the end of a quarter to provide me a summary of how my investments are doing. Legally required. Now, our industry isn't legally required to necessarily return data or study outcome results in any specific way, but moving forward, if we want to be considered conformant with patient centricity movements, we have to consider the patients investors in this sense in the clinical research process. They're just investing with different currency. They're investing their time, their bodies, their lives. In a way, not to downplay the importance of money, but this is more intrinsically important to the patient. This is what matters. So, and an excellent example of this is Pfizer's begun offering clinical trial result summaries prepared by third-party vendors in graphically enhanced 8th grade reading level summary documents. And as you can see, hopefully, this picture is a little bit small, but the most important parts of this clinical trial results, this is not some kind of dry scientific document. It opens with thank you. You belong, and we hope this helps you to understand. This is a message of inclusion and gratitude for their participation. And that up to this point is what patient centricity in the clinical research arena has been missing. And this is just another example of that same lay language summary of data that can be graphically represented as opposed to some kind of a summary table or raw numbers. It's colorized, it's very easy on the eyes, and it's very great to look at. Moving down one level from the study outcome is the individual participants' data. And in large part, patient centricity is driven by the patient's desire to understand their path through a clinical trial. It's not just about seeing the outcome of the study. If we go back a slide to, roughly half of the subjects in that pain study experienced a decrease in symptoms, half did not. Well, each person that reads that, where did I fall? I know how I feel like I did, but where did my data place me in all of these charts and graphs? Like, I don't know how my individual experience maps to the end result. And being flexible, as Ryan mentioned earlier in his presentation, we work in asthma trials, and pain would never have crossed any of our minds as something we would want to communicate to the patients or have any mechanism for having the dialogue. So when we consider how we're going to best use the participant data, we have to be flexible enough to accommodate varying levels of interest in the different aspects of it. We can't basically tell the patient at the outset what we think is important to the trial and expect everyone's desires to map around that. And making research patient-centric is to make an effort to return this data back to the patients. And in the immortal words of the OJs, you give the people what they want. A great example of this finer level of granularity is, again, Pfizer, and per the financial disclosure, I own no Pfizer stock. These just happen to be my two examples. Is their Department of Health and Human Services, their Blue Button pilot. Now, this pilot allows patients who participated in trials managed by Pfizer the ability to download their individual clinical data. And this fits really nicely amongst other reciprocity trends. You participate in the trial, you give us your data, we will return this back to you in some form or fashion. And there's a variety of uses for this data. Primarily, the subjects can share this at the conclusion of the trial for assistance in reuptake with their primary care providers. What happened to you when your care was assumed by another set of physicians during this trial? Are there any noteworthy events that we should know about? The subjects can also improve their overall health and wellness through better information. Do I know through a specific allergy and immunology trial that I have certain allergy triggers? Can I better my quality of life from the data that I actually provided to the study that I may not have been aware of? And finally, it does reinforce that patients are made partners in the trials in which they participate. Their data was just not fired off into a black hole, never to be seen again. It's a living, breathing thing and will be returned to them to help them understand how they fit in the process. And all of us have heard the participant that, patients want their data back. That's actually a misnomer. The patients don't want their data back. Patients want to understand. Personally, I'm interested in data. Those who participate in trials want to understand. And this pyramid, which looks remarkably akin to one of Ryan's, it was on his earlier slides, shows kind of the path from data, which are just our raw facts and figures, from contextualized data, which is information, to then knowledge. And then the jumps require context from data to information and subject matter expertise from information to knowledge. So just as an example of this, when someone says patients want their data back, I like to hold this up as, okay, this is data. This is actually an XML extract from my Garmin. I, like much of you, have some wearable fitness technology. This was a 10-minute workout, generated 3,000 lines of XML code. Nobody wants to look at this. This is not what patients want. What patients want is information, first and foremost. This is the same data in the dashboard application for my Garmin that shows me what happened during this workout, the duration, my heart rate, elevation, heart rate zones. This provides the context. So we're going from raw data to context. This isn't enough for knowledge, though. In order to make the transition, we have to provide subject matter expertise. Going back to the Garmin example, if I don't know what heart rate zone I'm looking for to maximize my workout, that piece of information is useless. If I don't know where I should be, when my heart rate is too high, when it is too low, what should I aim for, what are my goals, the data to information transition isn't enough. It's not knowledge. And for clinical research, investigators and clinic staff are crucial at this phase of the process. So my personal example from all this is my father recently participated in a clinical trial for a liver drug aimed at treating adults with non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Now, after going into the hospital and the research site and standard screening events, signed the informed consent, took samples, filled out questionnaires. A week later, he was informed over the phone that he was ineligible to continue in the trial due to an elevated FibroTest result. Now, I had to look this up. He was not told what that was. I looked this up on my own, just a linear regression performed on validated lab sample results. And there was no debrief, no advanced discussion, and no context given to that information. He was given a score and the name of the test, and that's why he was ineligible. And after consulting the almighty Google, being left to his own devices, he interpreted his score as stage 4, what ended up being stage 4 liver, just a liver impairment, as nearing total liver failure. Now, the real world implication of this is I spent a week on the phone with my father who lives in Indiana talking about his estate and his end-of-life plans, all while trying to talk him down off the ledge that I didn't see anything that said that he was in immediate risk of dying from this particular condition. And when he went back to be reuptake by his PCP, his doc was actually very surprised that no one had explained to him that he was at no immediate risk. He was just ineligible for the trial per the protocol. And if understanding is what patients like my father are after, the clinic staff and the investigators are the ones to get them there. Now, given, as Shannon said, the healthcare industry is very compact, tight on time, everyone is busy, but we can't basically punt the importance of these things. So we look to data to help us create better tools to leverage the information we have to help us, help the sites, help the patients. And the good news is there are flexible, low-cost options using very, very widely used commercial data collection platforms that offer a good starting point for experimenting with these new data sharing avenues. So slightly technical. I know if I actually included this slide because the first few presentations years back when people were talking about API, no one ever defined an API for me. So I'm just trying to repay the courtesy that we were not extended the first few times we had presentations like this. So it's an application programming interface, and any major EDC system is going to have some version of this. Now, just examples of actions that we can take through the use of this backdoor connection here between systems. We can upload external queries generated by other statistical programs. We can activate or reactivate a large number of data pages. We can import data, export study metadata, and importantly for this conversation, we can access a single subject's clinical data. So much like my Garmin data, this is an example of data leached out of the Medidata Ray VDC platform. So industry-leading platform, lots of folks are using it, highly standardized. So this is just an example of data from one data page in the system. Now, this XML can get extremely large. So that's data. So moving to information, we have basically extracted the entire data from a single subject from the system. Now we have to provide the structure to translate this to information. Fortunately for us, that particular XML file structure provides a roadmap for parsing the contents. And as the structure is contained in the file, we can skip any processing which requires intimate knowledge of the contents and head straight to the end interface. This is just a graphic representation of a soup to nuts XML to data exploration tool with no pre-processing required. So this is just an example, and this was 2 guys in a room. This was, we have an excellent programmer here, and we decided this would be a fun project to undertake just basically, when we had time. Quick, easy, not complicated. Any data management personnel or data scientists worth their salt will understand how to make all of this work. So this isn't highly, highly technical. And again, this is only information, and the fanciest tool in the world isn't the answer by itself. We all are responsible for using these tools to help further the patient's knowledge, and they're only a part of the solution. We have to listen to the patients and then look what we have at our disposal to help make it happen. And what patients find most interesting and important should affect how we look at the data in turn, going back to the flexibility. And we don't know what the patients are going to find most interesting. The tool should adapt to the desire of the individual patient and not the other way around. And this particular tool helps us even being jaded as to what we assume the data are telling us. So we don't have to look at it from a single point of view. And just added a Andrew Lang paraphrase here of we want to avoid the pitfall of using data exploration tools as a drunken man uses a lamppost for support rather than illumination. And assessing our return on investment. With a variety of data-driven options available, it's not cost-effective to implement every initiative we can invent. And so prioritizing those that provide the maximum return on investment is crucial. And if we're not soliciting feedback from the patients, we're doing ourselves a disservice and possibly wasting time and money on efforts that aren't being well received by the subject population. And another important thing to remember is patient needs and wants are going to change from study to study and year to year. And we have to remain committed to continually reassessing how these initiatives are performing as the needs and wants of the patients are changing. So current barriers, there are more than a couple. There's a very wide variety of data sources, formats, and accessibility schedules. Not all of our data comes from a single location that we get nightly or hourly exports from. All of this data has to be cobbled together, and trying to do it on the fly is extraordinarily difficult. There are legal concerns and even the possibility of biasing the trial outcome. And on top of all of that, in our industry, we have the rise of ePro data and wearable biosensors and issues of data volume and velocity. It's a lot easier to graphically represent 10 measurements than it is a blood pressure measurement that's being captured every 30 seconds for possibly months on end. So that volume of data becomes incredibly difficult to parse. And finally, change is just hard. And any change involving protected data in a heavily regulated industry is extremely difficult. And the Data Explorer example that we just saw is a perfect example of that. Again, the programmer and I just put this together to see if we could do it without any metadata information. And when we demoed this particular tool, there were quite a few groans. The loudest and most immediate were, you can't do this because you haven't set any barriers for possibly looking at outcome data. You could be biasing the outcome of the trial by reading the subject into how it's performing midstream, which, as it turns out, is an easy fix, but not something we considered up front. And I think the lesson I took away from that is we should create the tool in an ideological space where it provides the most benefit to the subjects. And then we should adapt that idea to the problems and not develop all of the tools with every problem in mind, because we're artificially limiting ourselves as we try to move forward and make progress. And so that wraps up my portion of the presentation. I will hand it back to Brooke and Ryan.
Joe, I think you're ready if you want to wrap us up and move to questions.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Unfortunately, we only have time for one question. So this comes from Melanie Goodwin at ICON, who really enjoyed the focus on the patient and agreed completely that's something that is not done well in the industry. Her question is, she likes some of the ideas, but how do you develop the right plan for the right patient study, and how do you customize in various countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, the way I think of it in sort of tiers, like you want to start with understanding your patient population in the disease area. And there's a lot of ways you can do this. You can talk to patient advocacy groups in that particular disease area. You can host a focus group with patients in your community or at the individual sites that you have working. I guarantee you, if you say, we want to hear from you, patients will respond to that. Patients want to talk, like I had that quote earlier. They want people to listen. So you can kind of open the doors and just ask questions about, understand the disease better, but then also, I think it's a good place to share ideas about what you're doing in research and say, would you participate in a trial that did this? Would you participate in a trial that did that? And then I think you want to learn about local needs at the individual sites. Shan alluded to some of this in what we did in one of the trials, but And this is where it gets to having some culturally competent staff that are familiar with your local patient populations. But what is transportation like? For example, getting to the individual clinic where you're conducting research. And we do a lot of studies in urban areas, and there's a lot of transportation options available. But the difference between taking your children, if you're a mother, on the subway versus having a taxi come pick you up and drop you off at the clinic is a big difference if you've got 2 or 3 kids in tow. So just understanding your trial and your patient population, your local population, having staff that are culturally competent. And then I think within any study, you can always be asking your patients. You can do patient satisfaction surveys, learn, and then adapt for the next study and grow your sort of knowledge base. I know we're short on time, but there's an interesting example. There was a study that I heard about where the visits were long, 3 or 4 hours, and they were worried about patient dropout. Patients were kind of getting fed up with the time, and they said, well, maybe the visits are too long, but they weren't sure, so they talked to the patients, and it turns out the time wasn't what bothered the patients so much as the fact that they didn't have anywhere comfortable to sit. They were in exam rooms, and they didn't have a comfortable chair. They didn't have a pillow to lean up against. And they said, if you would just give us more comfortable places to sit, we would actually be okay. And so it was just a simple question to patients about what would change their experience and make it better for them. So you have to ask patients. There's a few different ways to do that that I just mentioned, but I think that's where you have to start talking to them, finding ways to reach out to your population.
That's great. I'd like to thank everyone for attending this Fierce Markets webinar, and additionally thank all of our speakers for participating and Ro for presenting today's webinar. The webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours on the same page you used to register for the event. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.